Hi, welcome to GymB Live. Today we have an awesome webinar today, all talking about microbiology curriculum and the concept inventory. Today's paper is called Application of the Microbiology Concept Inventory to Improve Programmatic Curriculum. I'm super excited to bring these speakers to you today. As always, our presentation is being recorded and will be available on GymB's YouTube channel later next week. And the paper that we're going to be talking about today is available for free open access on GymB's website. The link is in your chat and I'll post it again shortly. So our speakers are going to talk today for about 20 to 25 minutes. At the end of that, we'll have lots and lots of time for your questions. So when you're listening to today's talk and reading the paper, please use the Q&A module in the lower part of your Zoom toolbar to write any question that you want for the speakers. If you have a technology question, you can do that as well. And you can also ask your question anonymously if you don't feel comfortable sharing your name. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, and I'll see you at the end of their talk.
All right. Hello, everybody. I am Danielle Condry, and I have Nguyen here with me, and we are really excited today to share with you our application of the Microbiology Concept Inventory to improve our curriculum in our program. So we're going to start by if you're not familiar with concept inventories, we wanted to make sure everybody knew what that was, because that is the tool that we utilize in our program. So concept inventories are standardized and statistically validated tools. What that means is these are shared across lots of students, across lots of institutions, and to make sure that these questions that we're asking in the concept inventory are actually getting at the student's understanding. And so we're assessing the student's understanding across whatever population is taking that concept inventory, whether that's within a program or comparing across different schools. These concept inventories are two-tiered. And what that means is we have multiple choice questions. So your standard question with 4 or 5 responses, depending on the concept inventory. And then the second tier is a portion that we ask the students to offer a rationale for why they chose the answer that they chose in that multiple choice question. This allows us to take both qualitative and quantitative data with our concept inventory. The quantitative data, just looking at the sheer scores for a question or across the entire concept inventory, and look at overall performance. And then that qualitative data comes from that rationale. And this is super important. Our paper doesn't go into this, but hopefully our next one will, where you can actually identify the misconceptions that students are holding when they answer these questions. The very first concept inventory that was developed and published was in physics, and that's the force concept inventory. But now there are tons of concept inventories that are published across all kinds of STEM fields. So how are concept inventories utilized? So some of these concept inventories are very focused, and they maybe cover content that is only covered in one course or one unit. Like the force concept inventory is just a small part of, for instance, an intro physics class. And so they can be taken pre and post to assess what students knew before and then what students knew after. Other types of concept inventories look really broadly at a topic or even an entire discipline. And these can be utilized to look at programmatically what are our students learning within different sections of that program. And again, pre and post, so we can compare that. So there are some pros and cons with any tool that you use. So the pros to concept inventories is these are really easy to implement. They're just like handing out any other exam in your class, and they're multiple choice. It's very clear what the students need to do on those. They are familiar with multiple choice questions, and then that rationale, just ask them, to think about why they chose their answer. These are standardized and validated, and so we can use them to compare across different populations. And they work really well for identifying misconceptions that you can follow up and do more research with or propose changes with. The cons to our concept inventories. So there's a paper that was published in 2021 about the force concept inventory. This is by John Buncher et al. And what they actually showed was that there was some bias shown in some particular questions in that concept inventory, meaning that the way those questions were written, it was more likely for white males to answer correctly. And that was compared to female populations. And so with that, I believe they actually threw out some of those questions that are no longer used in that concept inventory. And then the other thing is we just want to acknowledge there are limitations with multiple choice questions. They may not encompass all of the understanding of a particular topic within that question. And so they just are limited in that nature. The microbiology concept inventory came out of this kind of chain of events that occurred here. So biology published the Vision and Change document in 2011. And this focused all of biology onto 5 different areas and everything kind of fitting into those buckets. And so that was information flow and genetics, evolution, metabolic pathways, cell structure and function, and then systems. That information was taken and aligned with a lot of other biology areas that fit under that umbrella. And so ASM put together a task force to develop curriculum guidelines. And so they aligned microbiology concepts within each of these nested areas, adding microbial systems to that systems element. And then they also added the impact of microorganisms, because when we teach about microorganisms, we really want to share the big impact these little microorganisms have. Then, with those curriculum guidelines, another group, which some of them came off of that original curriculum group, developed the concept inventory. And so this concept inventory is 23 questions, again, multiple choice, plus that rationale, plus demographics at the end so that we can look at comparisons across demographics. And this group chose to include immunology into one of these questions because, as we all know, microbiology and immunology is oftentimes, especially in our core kind of general classes, is taught together. So, and Pashtin et al., Tim published this 2017. So the context of our work took place at North Dakota State University. Our student population is around 12,000 students, 12 to 13,000 students over this time frame. And 85% of our students are from North Dakota and Minnesota, which are primarily rural areas. The demographics of NDSU, so we've got 13.1% non-white. And I want to explain here why we lumped non-white together is for our purposes and trying to get numbers. If we split this down into different ethnicities, we get too small of numbers to compare different groups, as well as, especially with some of our classes, to maintain the anonymity of our participants. And so we have non-white and then white, which is the majority of the population at NDSU, and then pretty evenly split between female and male. The demographics of our study participants are a little bit different than the demographics of NDSU. We had 24.3% non-white students, 75.7% white. And then we've got a little, tip towards female here with 59.4% female, 39.6% male, and then 1% gender non-binary. NDSU doesn't actually publish their statistics with gender non-binary, but we assessed with that demographic in our survey. On the right side there, we have our table that just looks at our numbers from each of the classes that we assessed with our microbiology concept inventory. But we're probably going to abbreviate that as MCI for most of this. So we've got data from 2019 through 2023 included in this study. EP is early program. That is our freshman class, and they take the MCI within the first couple weeks of when they're on campus. We've then got mid-program. Mid-program are students who have just taken their first microbiology class, typically their sophomore year. And then they come into a class where it's majors and minors are mixed in that mid-program class. And then we've got FP, final program. These are our capstone students in their final semester here with us. And this is a majors only class. So the methods we took to administer our MCI there. So 2019, this was all done on paper and during class time. So we handed out just like a normal exam. and then students took it during that class, and we're done with that. In 2020, obviously something major happened in all of our lives that forced us to shift online. And so we moved the concept inventory to Qualtrics. It was still given during class time with synchronous classes. And these students then completed that on Qualtrics. And we've maintained that shift, especially because it made it a lot easier to process our data with that instead of manually entering things from paper. And then all of our students, they were graded on completion only for doing the MCI. They were not graded on how well they did. For statistical analysis, some of the questions we wanted to answer with stats were that our question, are the means of the MCI scores significant between groups? And so with 2 groups comparison, we used t-tests. With multiple groups, we used ANOVA. When we utilized ANOVA, we wanted to know which groups were different from one another. And so we added a 2P post hoc test to that to make sure we knew which groups were different from one another. And then how big is this difference? What is the effect size? We used Cohen's D to assess that. One thing that's really fun to share that doesn't necessarily get into papers is, why did we choose to do this work? So in 2018, I actually started at NDSU, and they were having conversations around whether they should align with the ASM curriculum guidelines. And it was a general kind of consensus and support in the department that yes, we should do this. And so we started looking at, well, how do we know where we're at now versus the changes that we're planning to make to align with ASM curriculum guidelines. And so I reached out to Tim and got a copy of the MCI. And so in 2019, we administered our MCI for the first time. And this was a terrifying experience for our faculty because our seniors scored 56% on the MCI. Again, this is out of 23. And so our seniors were scoring about 13 or averaging about 13. And I think worst off that we saw is that our final program score was lower than our mid program. And so our students who had only taken their one general microbiology class were doing better than our seniors who had taken multiple topic area specific classes. And so this really shook up our department, and we needed to do something about it and keep collecting data and figure out, are we making good changes? So our research questions became, can we inform programmatic change in our department by using the MCI? And then, did programmatic change impact the scores on the MCI? And is gender or ethnic bias detectable with MCI? Again, 2021, this paper came out, and we had been working with the MCI, collecting data at that point. We were like, wow, this is an interesting question to add, and hadn't been published yet. So I wanted to see what we could find. So this is the historical timeline of our work. So again, 2018, 2019, we started having those conversations and collected that first round of data there with our mid-program and final program. In 2019, this is when our expanded course list became available, as well as some alignment with the curriculum guidelines within our content-specific classes. And so our classes prior to this that were required were genetics and physiology. After 2019, all of our students were required, and again, this starts with the freshman requirements there. So we're not going to see the effect of those classes till those students are in their senior year. But we added virology, immunology, and microbial ecology to that list so that we could better encompass all of the curriculum guidelines within all those classes. We then continued to collect data so that we could see the progress of these changes. And then in 2021, we added the early program so that we could see what our baseline was. We hadn't been collecting that up to that point. And then we've been analyzing this data for several years. So we've got 5 years of data here. And then again, acknowledging that COVID shift happened to online, which not only affected how we collected data, but also obviously affected our classes with moving online and all the stress and those kind of things. So just to acknowledge that piece.
Okay, my turn. So this next section is going to be the results of all the statistical analysis that we ran. The first of these is the comparison that we ran between MCI scores of students majoring in microbiology versus students minoring in it. The only piece you really need to pay attention to here is the p-value you see on the right-hand side. So this p-value of 0.6995 being greater than the accepted threshold of 0.05 means that there was no significant difference in the scores of majors and minors. It's important to note here that the comparison was made specifically for students within the mid-program. This is because there are no minors in the final program course because it is a senior level capstone course that is majors only. And then in the early program course, it's expected that the students come in with similar levels of understanding of microbiological concepts. The next comparison we made was the scores between female and male students. I need to note that, like earlier, we did have a non-binary category that composed of roughly 1% of our students, but because of that small sample size, we couldn't run comparisons using that. And so this is just female and male students. Again, we see here that the p-value of 0.4575 is greater than that accepted threshold of 0.05. So there was no difference here seen in the scores of female and male students. We mentioned earlier that the forced concept inventory has shown that there is bias towards male students. So we anticipated to see a similar result here. That not being the case, we're interested to see if this result holds true as we get more incoming data. New incoming data. So here's where we see our first glimpse of significant results. The comparison we made here was between non-white and white students. I will re-emphasize the fact that we had to aggregate our ethnic groups into the non-white category because of the small sample size. Excuse me, I have to cough. So we had to aggregate it so that we were able to run some statistics on that. Having said that, there was a significant difference here, as you can see that p-value of 0.0485, which is below that acceptable threshold of 0.05. Since there is a significant p-value, the other piece here, the Cohen's d estimate, is also worth noting. Right? Remember that Cohen's d measures the effect size, or how big the difference is between the two groups. So the negative value there means that the scores were skewed towards white students and against the non-white students. And then that value of 0.2982 means that the effect size, or the size of the difference, was somewhere between a small and a medium effect size. Usually the cutoff for effect size is around 0.2 for small, 0.5 for medium, and then 0.8 or above for a large effect size. So this sits somewhere between a small and a medium effect size there. This significant difference in scores does indicate or does point to some indication of bias against non-white students. It doesn't fully establish the presence of bias. There are a couple more statistical analyses that need to be run there, but it is a step in that direction. The next comparison we made was between cumulative GPA brackets. As you can see here, there was a significant difference between A average students, which is the 3.5 to 4.0 bracket, and B and C average students, which are the 3.0 to 3.49 and 2.5 to 2.99 brackets, respectively. Also, I need to point out the Cohen's d estimates on these comparisons. Notice that these are huge. Like I mentioned earlier, that the threshold for a large effect size was above 0.8. So these are way over that. So there are differences between A average and B and C average, and these differences are big, right? But this is more or less expected, right? Because we would expect that our A average students are performing higher on average than our B and C average students. Okay. Here you can see the progression of scores across the 5 years that we've been doing the study. What I really want to point out here, that's okay. What I really want to point out here is the tiered progression. Starting as students in the early program, looking specifically at the year 2021 and then also 2022. But you start at the lowest average with the early program, and then you get a little bit higher in scores with the mid-program, and then finally, or lastly, you have the final program students scoring the highest on this. This is good and expected because it shows two things here. The first is that our curriculum is doing a pretty good job of developing and advancing our students' understanding of microbiology as they progress through our program. The second is that after the curriculum changes that took place in 2019, things started to rebalance and kind of shift to what we see now. Right? You might notice that the scores of the mid-program students and to a lesser extent the final program students were on a downward trend from the 2020 to 2022 timeframe. We suspect that the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact here. So between the switch from in-person instruction to online hybrid instruction, compounded with all of the different various challenges with social, physical, and mental well-being and health, likely had an impact here on the scores in some way, shape, or form. It's also worth noting, it's also worth pointing out where all of these scores sit relative to the maximum score of 23. So our final program students, despite scoring the highest on average, still peaked at roughly 16 out of 23, which is just shy of a C average. So there is a little bit of room for improvement there. We'd like to see them have a higher level of proficiency as they approach the end of their program. So this tiered progression of early program being the lowest, mid program being the middle of the group, and then high or FP being the highest is actually a good segue into our next slide. So we do have statistics to back up this trend here that we see. And so we ran comparisons across the board between EP, MP, and FP. And what we found was that there are significant differences all across the board. So you see those p-values on the right there, all below 0.05. And also look at those Cohen's d estimates. Those, again, here are massive, right? So not only are there significant differences between our freshman level, our sophomore level, and then our senior level students, but those differences are huge, right? Above that 0.8 threshold. Again, here, that's more or less expected, right? Because we would expect that our freshman level students are coming in with the lowest amount of comprehension, and then so on and so forth, right? It also shows that our students are becoming more progressively adept at understanding microbiological concepts as they progress through our program. Okay. So with these results, there's a couple of considerations to go along with that. The first is something that we talked about earlier, and that the COVID-19 pandemic likely had a large influence on what we saw here in this study. So the challenges of the pandemic, whether that was through instruction or health, likely influenced the students' scores. And so given the recency of the pandemic, it's really, really likely that we're going to see some effect of this lingering for at least a couple more years to come. And the other consideration is the inherently small sample size of the study, because since we are at the mercy of enrollment and cohort sizes, we can't exactly distribute the MCI to hundreds of students every year. But having said that, we are slowly building our stockpile of data as students come in through the program and as they trickle on in and out. So here's probably the slide you're probably most interested in. What does all of this mean for you and for other instructors? Well, with the study, we demonstrated that the MCI is a useful tool that can be used to evaluate microbiology comprehension in students within a curriculum. Knowing what these students know, don't know, or have misunderstandings about can lead to targeted changes in the curriculum or even specific lessons that will address those gaps in student understanding. With these changes, because there is hard data behind it, they carry more weight when you present them to the teaching faculty responsible for these courses. And as far as research goes, there's a couple of different directions to go in the next step. The first of which is something that we're working on right now, which is looking at the rationale portion of the MCI. So remember that in addition to the multiple choice questions, the students were prompted to justify their answers. And so in those justifications or the free response questions, we can pick apart their answers, and then we can identify trends in misconceptions or lack of understanding that are widely affecting our students. So once we're done with this, then we can compare these misconceptions to those that are published in published studies that have found or identified common misconceptions in their own students, and see if there's any overlap or overarching themes in misconceptions. This sets us up to connect our misconceptions that we found to specific courses and specific lessons and or specific lessons, and initiate collaborations with faculty, the faculty that teach those courses and lessons to improve the instruction using an evidence-based approach. And so once those changes take place, then we can look to see if those changes or to what extent those changes have in future MCI scores. We can see if our students are actually progressing there. The other direction of this research gets at the bias aspect that we touched on earlier. While we did establish that there is potentially bias against non-white students, there is some additional analysis that needs to be run. For example, differential item functioning, or DIF, gets at which specific questions are students performing differently within demographic groups, or which specific questions may be biased. On the other hand, it could be that the MCI itself may not necessarily be biased, but rather the instruction side. So the instructor or how the material is being taught could have some inherent bias in it. And so future work could get into picking apart that difference there.
So we just want to acknowledge all the people who helped. So what's not on this slide is all the students who've taken the MCI, that we greatly appreciate their time and efforts, as well as the course instructors who implemented the MCI in their courses, Birgit Preuss, Teresa Burkles, Penny Gibbs, and Rachel Richmond. We had some statistical analysis support with John Buncher, Julia Bauscher, and the R ladies. We love the R ladies. And then we had some manuscript feedback from Birgit Preuss and Tara Slominski. And this is not all possible if we did not have the support, both financial support for our TAs who do the analysis and the work, as well as paying our undergraduate students, and especially Maddie and Macy, our first authors. Got a shout out to them that they were undergraduates on this project and did a whole lot of work. And our department is really receptive to these changes and collecting this data and supporting our work so that we can make positive change in our department. And we are the equity teaching community, the etc. research group at North Dakota State Microbiology Sciences. And with that, we can take questions here.
Okay, so participants, and you have questions, let's go ahead and add them to the chat. And remember, I'm sorry, not to the chat, the Q&A box. And you do have the option to ask it anonymously. And I won't use anybody's names in the recording today. Let's get started. I have a couple questions to kick us off. First, you indicated that some of these students have seen this a couple of times, right? Like some of them have seen it 3 times. Do you have any evidence if people remember taking it and maybe their scores were influenced by taking it multiple times?
I can tackle this first. We didn't collect any evidence about that. We have anecdotal comments that our students typically don't remember it. It's at least, I'm trying to think, so beginning of freshman year, overwhelming in the first couple weeks, they take it, and how well their memories are functioning at that point maybe influences that. And it is a full year and a half until they see it again. And then it's another, is it 2 years after? It's a little over 2 years after that they see it again. And so our students are claiming they don't remember the questions, but we haven't formally assessed that. But that is a concern.
And talk a little bit, do the students get a grade or some kind of credit when they do this for you?
So 2 of the classes, this is administered in our standards-based classes. And so we just encourage them to do their best, and we don't give points or anything. It's just an expectation that they complete it. And we have fantastic students who they do it. And granted, it's given during class time, so there's not like kind of a choice to opt out. And based on the thoughtful responses we're getting in the rationale, they're taking it seriously. But they are not, it is not graded on how well they do. It is just, we expect them to take it as part of the course.
One purpose of Jim B Live is to help broader audience understand what goes into educational research such as this. Can you talk a little bit about whether this study, you had to have an IRB approval, Institutional Review Board, or was it exempt? And talk just a little bit about what that entailed and why that's important for this study.
Want me to keep going?
Yeah, that's
okay. So yes, we did do IRB. It is considered, it is in one of the, exempt categories in our IRB. However, it still went through a review, and we have an IRB number, which is actually published in our paper. And we include, the questions that we're going to ask. In our review, they specifically look at demographic questions because we have some limits on what we can and cannot ask students in our state. And so it is definitely through a review process. It's really quick and it's all online for us. And so it's pretty painless to go through that. But since it's, we give the MCI as part of a class, it's considered a class artifact, and therefore we're exempt from a full review.
So was that process overly onerous, or it sounds like it was more quick and easy for you?
Maybe, it's pretty quick.
Yeah.
They ask very directed questions, and we have a really fantastic team in our IRB office that you call and they answer, and they
step of the way.
Answer your question right away, and so they make it pretty painless.
Outstanding. I'd like to talk a little bit about this ethnicity gap that you found. First off, have you seen evidence that other concept inventories show a similar gap between ethnicities, not white or non-white or other groupings that other publications have shown?
I think the only one that I am aware of that has come out is the gender bias with the forced concept inventory. I haven't seen anything widely shared for other concept inventories. I think that forced concept inventory was like the first one that kind of broke the ice about that. And in lieu of, like things that happened in 2020, like the Floyd situation and all that kind of stuff, that focus is coming into view. And I think more people are asking those types of questions. So I think we're at the very
educational equity is all about, trying to eliminate any of those opportunity gaps.
Exactly. And it very well could be, it's not the MCI, it could be some other systemic problems, but there's a lot more research that has to be done to tease that apart.
Yes. Mike, would you like to come on and ask your question? Michael is a GMB staff, and he has a great question about this race ethnicity.
Thank you, Rachel. So the two, I think this sort of follows on, but you were talking about sort of the follow-up testing between the scores from non-white and white students. I was curious if you could speak more to that, and then what the eventual follow-up, might be sort of recommended out of the results of that analysis. And I suppose sort of a follow-up to that also is when you discussed assessing whether it was something about the MCI or how it was being taught, how that would be measured.
Do you want to start with what you introduced about the question? Yeah.
Like what differential item functioning?
Yep.
Yeah, so differential item functioning is an analysis that you can do to pick apart which individual questions students are scoring differentially on. So that's just another bit of evidence there. But I think to truly get into it, you might need to go into the rationales to pick their phrasing apart there. And I think the forced concept inventory with the gender bias thing did use differential item functioning among, I think, other things as well. But
And something that we know some folks here at NDSU are also working on, I gotta remember what this is called. Instead of the misconception framework, it's more so looking at the resources that students, so that positive framing of the resources that students are bringing into the classes. And that a resource framework might be a way to also tease apart any kind of bias. So if it's not the MCI, can we do interviews and find out what kind of resources students are getting? I don't know if we want to make it a 3-tiered MCI, but so where they're pulling that information from to get at the resources that they're utilizing to answer individual questions. And then does that answer, or what we can do if we do find bias, right? And so if it's in the MCI, what they've done with the forced concept inventory is they eliminated some questions. They did talk about revising. They could either revise the questions or eliminated them. And at this point, they eliminated, I think it was 2 questions.
Something like that, yeah.
From that concept inventory. So that's an option. If it's not the MCI and it's resources, then can we look at providing better resources to help fill that gap for students, especially in our final program? Like, can we look at those classes and provide resources that'll help, especially for students who maybe they came, like a lot of our students, they come from high schools where they've never heard of microbiology until they get to our programs. And so they're going to come in with a very different background related to microbiology than students who had the opportunity to take microbiology in high school.
I'm always thinking about so here you present a very quantitative look of learning. And I think your future study, you kind of want to do more of a qualitative look to find out what's causing those gaps or those biases. So.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, a couple of questions from our attendees. I got one more, but I think I'll wait for the end because it's a little challenging, I think. So we'll do some questions from our attendees. This person says, very impressive talk. Did you calculate the inter-rater reliability statistics when you administer the MCI? And can you talk about what inter-rater reliability stats means?
Sure. Inter-rater reliability, to my understanding, it gets more at the qualitative side of things. So when we're doing the thematic analysis that we're currently in the process of right now, usually you have 2 coders, and then to tackle all of the data, there needs to be a mutual understanding of how you're interpreting the answers. And so inter-rater reliability is just the level of agreement between the 2 coders there. And so with the stats that we presented here, because that's more quantitative, using the scores and demographics, there didn't have to be inter-rater reliability there because there wasn't the qualitative piece there. But once we start getting into the thematic analysis, that's when we're going to do inter-rater reliability there. So yeah.
Next question. Can you give an example of the types of questions that are asked and how were the questions picked and who was involved in formulating them? So I think this relates to what you know about the development of the MCI, the original MCI.
Well, we happen to have an expert on, Rachel is on that paper. We were not a part of that. So we've cited Tim Passion in, so that paper is where you would get all the lowdown there. But in short, what they do, so they took the curriculum guidelines and develop, typically it's true and false questions is the first step. And Rachel's nodding. So they develop those true and false questions that align with those curriculum guidelines. And from there, they send out all those true and false questions to students. And those students answer them, true and false, but they also provide an explanation. And those explanations can be used to make some really killer distractors for the multiple choice questions, because they're actually misunderstandings that are commonly found in students to use as a distractor from the correct answer. So then they come back and they take a look at the responses, they develop multiple choice questions, they narrow it down some from all the true and false questions that they got back from that data. And then they do another round of students where they take the multiple choice questions, they do the rationale, they take that data, refine it further until they get the final version that everyone is able to access via emailing Tim. That's how we got it.
That's right. And it's important to note that this took a lot of time, the original development of the MCI. It took an NSF grant to ASM and Tim Passion. It took 2 years of development. And I think we worked with 10 institutions from around the country, around the USA. And so that's 10 IRBs, thousands of students. And it's not just a test that you can come up with overnight. So you hit the nail on the head. And I think the important thing also to note that any concept inventory has to be administered together. Like all the questions have to be administered in one unit, or else the test isn't valid. So I'll just note that if you've never used a concept inventory, there are certain rules of using them, or else you're not going to get the results that the original researchers found. I just posted the link in the chat so you can find the 2017 article.
I'm going to piggyback on what Rachel said, is that this is an incredibly long process and involves a lot of different people, but involving students from multiple institutions is hopefully one of the things that can limit bias in development of these concept inventories, so that you are getting diverse student populations from across the country or even across the world if possible.
That'd be great to get international communities as well helping with the development of a concept inventory. Next step. Look, we're coming up with so many great ideas for our next research projects. Hope, Johnny, you have time, right?
Yeah, well, maybe postdoc.
Maybe, yeah, postdoc grant.
Postdoc grant.
All right, next question from an attendee. Have the instructors taken the MCI as well? They're curious as to what instructors or graduate students score on this inventory.
I'm curious about that too.
So all the faculty in our department took it I think it was either after we got our scores in that spring of 2019 or like that fall. And it was really interesting. So the faculty by and large scored in that like 21 to 23 out of 23. However, the questions that some people missed were heavily debated in a faculty meeting. And, the different sides of, well, I can argue it this way and that kind of stuff. But so our faculty are doing really well on it. We haven't ever administered it to our grad students while they're in grad school.
Right.
There are a few of our grad students who were our undergrads and took it, and one of them might be sitting right here, and that might be how I convinced him to come and do a PhD, was that exploring some of these things that he was curious about.
So the MCI, oh, go ahead.
I won't say which year Johnny was in. Yeah.
So the MCI can be used for either like one general survey microbiology course, or in your instance, to evaluate a whole program curriculum in microbiology. And as the use depends on what your context is, right? Like not many schools have a full microbiology program that could do early, mid, and final. They just have one microbiology course, right? My question is, I want to know a little bit about the process of change in your curriculum based on this data. And I'm interested because I'm always thinking about how do we positively impact the academy to make evidence-based changes. So can you talk a little bit about convincing all your faculty to embark on this journey of changing your programmatic curriculum when you started at North Dakota?
So I think the first thing I want to acknowledge is we have a fantastic group of faculty that are thinking about how they're teaching and want to improve for the students' benefit. And so that might be different than some other environments. And so they're very receptive to change along those lines. And I think that is one of the most influential things that we were able to do the work that we did. And so I remember very well the faculty meeting where we shared this original data from, and it was a conversation that could have went into blaming, and it was more so, what do we need to do to fix this, was the reaction. And so that's where we started looking at, changing the classes that we're requiring, which some of our faculty were like, great, I will have more students in my class then. And so there was kind of that perspective, but then each of the faculty who teach our required classes sat down with me over coffee most of the time. And we went through all of the curriculum guidelines and determined which ones apply to their courses and how they are covering them in their courses. And so they were willing to sit down and take the time and do those things. Granted, shortly after that, COVID happened and we all pivoted online. And in some cases, especially that spring semester, we cut, down our curriculum, just to help students cope with that mental load during that semester. So that was probably an impact in the data. And we're hoping that at some point here, we see a bigger shift, that our faculty and the changes they've made are being less impacted by COVID, and we can start to see those changes more readily. And that might really come out in our specific question analysis and looking at those misconceptions and those kind of pieces. So
it's great to hear that you had so many faculty on board with seeing very clear evidence of a validated, reliable tool and open their eyes and were willing to work together to bring about the change for the positive learning environment of students.
Yeah, our chair is incredibly supportive of our work and helping to make all this possible. So
exciting. And I'll plug in real quickly that the original curriculum guidelines were from 2012. And we had a task force for ASM to look at those curriculum guidelines, think about the state of microbiology and where the things that we've learned in the last 10 years of microbiology, which is so much, right? So coming out in 2024 will be new curriculum guidelines, and you can look for that. We'll have a big announcement through ASM and hopefully a Jim B article sometime next year. So be looking for that and get really excited. But, I think what we found is that overall, the curriculum guidelines were quite good and quite evergreen, but there's huge strides in things like microbiome and molecular analysis that really weren't reflected in those original guidelines. So look for that. So last comment, one person did say thank you to all the researchers who continue this work and apply the MCI, and they really appreciated the talk. And with that, we don't have any more questions, so I'll close it out. And I just wanted to thank my speakers so much for being here. We appreciate your time and attention and sharing your work with us. And I'm really excited to see it. It made my day to read this paper. So
thank you.
No, you're very welcome. We won't have any more Jim B Lives in 2023, but don't worry, we'll be back. You can check the Jim B Live webpage for more episodes starting in January or February of next year. In the meantime, do try to join us at ASM Conference for Undergraduate Educators, November 17th to 19th in Phoenix, Arizona. It's going to be really fun. Thanks, everybody, for